Hello everyone, and welcome back to Short Horror Stories. And don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe if you like the video. It was a quiet, overcast night as Sophie boarded the train. The air felt heavy, as if it were thick with secrets. The journey was supposed to be a simple overnight trip to her grandmother's in a small town across the state. Sophie settled into her seat, wrapped herself in her coat, and stared out the window at the dark, passing landscape. The train was nearly empty. A handful of other passengers were scattered about, each in their own world. A mother quietly whispered to her child, an elderly man read a newspaper, and a businessman typed furiously on his laptop. The lights inside the train flickered now and then, casting a dim, unsettling glow across the rows of seats. Sophie glanced at her phone. No signal. It didn't matter much. She planned to rest for most of the trip anyway. But as she leaned her head back and closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. An hour into the journey, just as she was starting to doze, the train jolted. Slowly, it began to decelerate until it came to a full stop. Sophie opened her eyes, confused. Outside, only darkness stretched as far as she could see, the trees forming ominous silhouettes in the night. A crackling voice came over the intercom. The sound was faint, almost muffled. "Attention, passengers. We'll resume shortly. Please remain in your seats." But the voice didn't sound normal. It had an odd metallic echo to it, and Sophie couldn't quite place why it sounded so wrong. As the minutes dragged on, the passengers started shifting in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. Sophie tried to brush off the feeling, convincing herself it was a minor delay, maybe a signal problem. But something inside her whispered that it was more than that. The lights flickered again, this time staying out a little longer before they blinked back on. And then she saw it. Outside the window, just beyond the tree line, was a shadow. At first, Sophie thought it was just the shape of a tree in the darkness, but as she looked closer, she realized it was moving. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a thin, twisted figure that seemed to stretch into the mist. Her heart pounded, and she quickly looked away, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. But a sinking feeling crept in. She wasn't imagining things. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. Just then, she heard a soft rustling. She turned, expecting to see one of the other passengers moving about. But what she saw instead made her blood run cold. One of the seats where an elderly man had been sitting was now empty. His jacket and newspaper lay discarded on the seat. It was as if he'd simply vanished. Sophie scanned the car, but there was no sign of him. More unsettling still, no one else seemed to notice. A chill swept over her as she began to realize, one by one, the other passengers were disappearing. She watched as, every so often, someone would rise, stretch, and make their way down the aisle, perhaps to the bathroom, or to ask the conductor about the delay, but they wouldn't return. Sophie's fingers clenched the armrests as her eyes darted nervously from one seat to another, counting. There were fewer passengers now than when they had first stopped. She was sure of it. She tried to reassure herself. Perhaps they were all just in another car. Then from behind her, a soft voice whispered, "Don't look at them." Sophie jumped, spinning around to see an elderly woman leaning forward, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear. "They'll only come for you if you look at them," she whispered again, clutching Sophie's arm. Sophie felt her stomach churn as she stammered, Who are they?" The woman just shook her head. "The shadows. They take you if they sense your fear. Don't look at them. Don't let them see you." Suddenly, The woman's hand fell away, her expression shifting to something distant, almost blank. She turned and walked down the aisle, disappearing into the shadows at the end of the car. And then, she was gone. Sophie sat frozen, her eyes fixated straight ahead. She couldn't bear to look around her. Her heart raced, her breathing shallow. She tried to focus, to think of a way out. Slowly, she lifted her eyes, careful not to look directly down the aisle, but instead glancing at the reflection in the window next to her. And that's when she saw them. Dark, gaunt figures drifted through the aisles, their eyes hollow, their limbs grotesquely elongated. They moved soundlessly, weaving in and out of the rows, their heads tilting and twitching, as if they were listening for something. Sophie bit her lip, fighting the urge to scream. She wanted to move, to run, but she couldn't look away from the sight in the reflection. Her mind raced, remembering a story her grandmother had told her once, a legend about an old train line that was cursed. The Last Stop, it was called, a train that traveled eternally, claiming the souls of those who boarded it, trapping them forever. According to the story, the only way to survive was to not let the shadows see you, to not look at them. Desperate for answers, Sophie quietly rose from her seat, inching her way down the aisle. She kept her head low, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. The train was so quiet now, unnaturally quiet. She couldn't hear any movement from the other cars, no voices, nothing but the faint hum of the engine. She reached the conductor's car, her fingers shaking as she opened the door. Inside, she found an old leather-bound journal on the conductor's seat. Trembling, she opened it, scanning the pages. Each page held frantic handwritten notes from different conductors, describing encounters with the shadows, the disappearances, and the endless journey. One passage read, "The last stop is eternal. Those who board are merely visitors. They cannot leave unless they break the curse." Sophie's eyes widened. She turned the page and found a crude drawing of the train, along with a single line scrawled beneath it. "Pull the emergency brake if you dare." But there was one problem. To reach the emergency brake, she would have to pass through the darkest, most crowded car, the car where she'd last seen the shadowy figures. Steeling herself, she took a deep breath, clutching the journal as she moved back down the aisle. She kept her head down, not daring to meet the hollow stares she felt, pressing in on her from every side. Finally, she reached the emergency brake. Her hand hovered over it, hesitating. What if pulling it didn't help? What if she'd be trapped here forever? But then, a cold whisper echoed in her ear. "They're coming for you." In a surge of terror, Sophie yanked the brake. The train screeched, metal grinding against metal as it came to a violent halt. The shadows screeched too, a ghastly sound that filled the air, reverberating through her bones. And then, silence. Sophie opened her eyes, gasping, and found herself alone on a dark, desolate train platform. The train was gone, vanished into the night. A newspaper rustled by her feet, bearing today's date and a chilling headline, "Missing Persons Vanish on Haunted Train." But as relief started to wash over her, she heard it, the faint, distant whistle of an approaching train, and in the depths of her soul, she realized the last stop was coming back for her.